Hello.
Vegfest Morocco, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh my goodness, we're so excited to speak to you. Just in case people don't know who you are, Dr. Roger Yates is a sociology lecturer at University College Dublin and the University of Wales. He's done incredible work for the animal rights movement since the 70s and has been a part of countless protests and groups dedicated to treating animals better. Dr. Yates also runs the website On Human Relations with Other Sentient Beings. His focus on speciesism is especially innovative, and he's passionate about teaching others the importance of erasing the line between human and non-human beings.
Yes, all that is true.
Perfect. When you're ready, Dr. Yates, I'd love to learn more about this and, teach us. I'm excited.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for that. And I want to thank you for inviting me and all the other organizers and all the tech people. I know that these are big jobs and there's a lot of stuff going off behind the scenes. So I'm going to talk about the philosophy of the vegan social movement and its kind of evolution in its first few decades, because there's a big push about a 6-year span from 49 through to 1955 or so. There's a span when vegan philosophy kind of came into being. And so I want to talk about that and pick out a particular writer who was very kind of influential. There we go.
There we go.
Right, excellent. So maybe the equipment will work for us now.
Yes,
so we're talking about the vegan social movement. And so when we talk about the vegan social movement, we're not really talking about the people who had these ideas, original ideas that nobody before had thought about, say, plant-based eating, for example, or thought about our relations with other animals. Really, what picks out these people is that they are the first people that we're aware of who came together and formed a social movement, this kind of broad social alliance, as it says there. And they formed a cause, essentially. And they also named that cause, and we call that cause veganism. And so that's what we're talking about. And in terms of types of social movements, what we have with the vegan social movement is it fits into that third category of a revolutionary movement. Veganism is a very big, radical, revolutionary idea. We want to effectively change the world. So we're talking about a cultural revolution, essentially, and that's what they stood for, and that's what they wanted to do. So in that sense, the people who started our movement, the vegan social movement, were kind of revolutionaries. And here we have some of their names. Now, with a lot of social movements and with the vegan movement as well, there's a lot of women involved, but often it's the men who are the ones who are best known. And sadly, that's the case with the vegan social movement. But so I've put the female names first, really, just to highlight the fact that there's a lot of women involved with the foundation of our movement. In terms of writing and thinking, probably the most important female name there is Kathleen Janaway, not least because she went on and formed a group called Movement for Compassionate Living, which is still online, and it's really quite interesting. Mm-hmm. When we come down to the names at the bottom, Arthur Ling is important for developing plant milks. Donald Watson is the best known co-founder. And the one I'm really focusing on for this talk is the name at the bottom, Leslie Cross. He's a very interesting character, and he's got a powerful role to play in this story of the evolution of vegan philosophy. He became vegan in 1942, and he died in 79, as you can see there. Yeah. He was one of our pioneers, but he also was a pioneer in developing, with Arthur Ling, plant milk. So if you enjoy plant milks now, then this man had some role to play in all that, as well as developing the philosophy of veganism. So he's an important person in terms of the history of our movement. He was a great friend of Donald Watson, and it's interesting because there are some claims that Watson and Cross didn't really get on. But whenever I see Donald Watson talking about Leslie Cross, he talks about him in very kind of warm terms, and he says he was very influential pioneer in our movement. The thing that they shared as ideas was this bit here. And what we're going to see in the next few minutes is all these ideas coming together, that our liberation, human liberation, and other animal liberation are entangled ideas. They're things that go together. And that's
quite revolutionary, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. And it's an idea that some people in the movement resist nowadays, but it's a very kind of revolutionary idea. And essentially what they're saying is, if we liberate them, the other animals, we're going to be liberating ourselves. And you'll see that play out in the next few minutes in a way. Now, this is a direct quote from Donald Watson about Leslie Cross, again, pointing out that he was one of the outstanding people, pointing out that he was a volunteer, like all the early people were volunteers, and also pointing out that he used to give a talk after he retired from his day job, as it were. He used to give a talk called The Milk of Human Kindness. So he's obviously doing a bit of advertising for plant-based milk as well. But essentially going around telling people what, vegan philosophy was all about.
And can I ask you, what kind of milk specifically? Do you know if he first started with, like,
it was soy milk.
Yeah,
okay. That's right. Yeah. In fact, really, in the early days, that's about the only thing. I remember the very first soy milks. Some of them were very chalky, but I quite like that one. And then, you see, funny enough, nowadays, there's a lot of plant milks now which are a little bit too close to cow milk for me. And so I still like the watery ones that I'm used to, so it's quite an interesting thing. It's a little bit the same with the vegan meats. Some of them are so realistic.
They're a bit off-putting, aren't they?
Yeah. I had to give a packet of them away a few months ago because it was just too realistic, and I just didn't like it, So, but he was very influential in the development of the plant milks. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the philosophy, this is where he comes into his own, in the sense that we've got Samantha Calvert here. Now, I'm not quite sure whether she still works for them, but she used to work for the Vegan Society. And she says, although the vegan diet was defined early on, it was as late as 1949 before Leslie J. Cross pointed out that the society lacked a definition of veganism. Now, this is an important statement, because some people say, well, doesn't that basically mean then that first and foremost, veganism was seen as the diet? And the answer to that is no, except for the first few years, they did focus a little bit on diet. And the reason for that is because everyone that they knew, including their doctors and all their vegetarian friends, they told them they were going to die, because in those days, the idea of a human body being able to function without animal products was unheard of. And most expert opinion was that they were actually going to lose their life. I always say that they decided to risk it for a vegan biscuit, and they thought, okay, well, it's the right thing to do. We believe it's the right thing to do, veganism. And so therefore, if there's a health hit, we'll take it. Turned out that it wasn't the case, but that's what everybody said. So when Leslie Cross came in 1949 and said, okay, well, we've sorted out that first issue, as it were, now we need to really develop the philosophy of veganism. And that's what they set out to do after that point. So this is the kind of story about that. And so these are some of the initial thoughts. First of all, Cross said that there was a historical continuity between the vegan movement and earlier social movements. Now, this is interesting in the sense that we'll see that eventually both Cross and Watson and others like Eva Batt, they started to believe that veganism became more important than other social movements. So we'll see that develop in a minute. He said that where the values of veganism put into effect, every basic wrong done to non-human animals by humanity would automatically disappear. So obviously that's going to be the first effect of veganism, that our exploitation of other animals would just end. So that's the first thing that would happen, if you like. He says the heart of veganism is the healing power of compassion, the highest expression of love of which humans are capable. So there are some kind of spiritual vibes, if you like, to some of the writing of Leslie Cross. And there's another quote coming up where it's a little bit more developed even, but essentially they were trying to work out, why humans have become so violent, and they wanted to resolve that. And they thought that veganism was the key to getting us back onto the right path, if you like.
Yeah,
so
because
this
people argue that well, other animals kill for food as well, but it's not the same. Like, we've completely industrialized our killings, and we've normalized far more violence than we ever see in nature. So it's interesting that they were finally, talking about this.
Yeah, well, of course, what people forget, I mean, they often say things like, nature is red in tooth and claw and those kind of things. What they often forget is that most other animals don't eat other animals. They're herbivores.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they have to be more herbivores than there are carnivores, otherwise the system wouldn't even work. And so they often forget that point, And so most other animals are not violent towards each other, in the first place. And so why, when we pick a model to follow, it's like non-vegans go, well, what about the lions? They always pick the lions, right? And you go, why pick the lions? Why not pick a herbivore model? So Leslie Cross said that veganism was a giving without the hope of a getting. And basically this is focused on our relations with other animals. They're basically saying that we want to help them and care for them and end their exploitation. And we don't necessarily expect anything back from the other animals. However, he did say that we will get something very big back, because humanity would free itself from many of the demands made by our lower nature, as they saw it. Mm-hmm. He said the benefit of veganism to humanity would be incalculable. So this is another very important point, and another kind of development of the philosophy, if you like, because they thought that that we'd gone into some form of barbarity. They'd lived through two global conflicts, World War I and World War II, and they thought that it's hard for us in this day and age to really understand their mindset, I think. But I mean, they had lived through the Second World War. They'd learned about the concentration camps. They'd learned about what we were willing to do to each other as a species. And they thought, what's gone wrong with us? Why are we so violent? And they really then did think that veganism was the kind of answer to that. And we'll see that in one particular idea, which is called the moral evolution of humanity, in a couple of minutes. Here it is now. There you go.
Perfect.
I got my order wrong. So moral evolution, yeah. So Leslie Cross, this is a big theme in Leslie Cross's writings. And he says that a great historical wrong would be righted by veganism. And you see this bit in the middle, he says, effect on the course of evolution must have been stupendous. Basically, what they were saying was that we had started to exploit other animals. And as you said, more and more in an industrial manner. Mm-hmm. And essentially what they're saying is that humanity had made a mistake. We'd gone the wrong way. And that veganism was the way out of this problem. And it would bring us out of the kind of the pit of barbarity that we'd put ourselves into. So they saw it as moral evolution. So veganism for them was the fact that if we develop a vegan mindset and then a vegan society, we would elevate humanity on a moral level. So it was really in our self-interest, to become vegan, as much as it's going to be obviously very, very beneficial to other animals. It was one of their major themes. This is interesting as well, because they declared themselves as abolitionists. Cross said that veganism wasn't to make the oppressor and oppressed relationship bearable, but to totally abolish that relationship. This was really kind of articulated later by Professor Tom Reagan, the great animal rights philosopher. And he's got a famous phrase that people might know, which is, we don't want bigger cages, we want empty cages, right? And so that's what they were getting at here. So we're not wanting to make things more humane. We want to abolish the exploitation.
Well, that's a big argument, isn't it, these days, where it's like, oh, it's a cage-free egg, or it's a grass-fed.
That's right. Yeah.
You know, all of these terms that they're using, which at the end of the day essentially mean nothing, because there's still that form of exploitation and turning an animal into a commodity.
Yeah, well, funny enough, I'm associated with this vegan-run sanctuary in Ireland called Back into Daylight, and about 4 months ago, we were invited to rescue 200 free-range hens from a free-range egg farm.
Wow.
And they were in a terrible state. I mean, essentially, it was like one big cage. You know, their combs were floppy, they'd been debeaked, their feathers were off, their back ends were bloody. They were in a right mess. And yet they were marketed as, you know, kind of top range free range. You know, I mean, it was actually called organic free range. And so they got a premium for the eggs. But in terms of animal rights, animal liberation, even animal welfare, it meant nothing really, you know, absolutely nothing. So Cross says, in this light, veganism is not so much welfare as liberation. And then we get the caveat yet again, for the creatures, the other animals, of course, and for the mind and heart of humanity. So by liberating other animals, again, we're liberating ourselves. And this theme is rehearsed and repeated over and over and over again in the writings of the people who started our movement. They really thought that we were doing ourselves a massive favor by bringing about a vegan world, because we have then a world which is based on peace, on non-violence, and on justice. So I tend to say that veganism stands for justice for all. So this is 1951 now. We're evolving our philosophy. And this is where that kind of spiritual idea, freedom to live our own lives in our own way, according to our own inward light, is fundamental to our view of life itself. This is Cross writing. So that's a little bit, you know, in that kind of thing, but it's also a bit anarchic, you know, the idea of organizing our lives in our own way, which is quite good. There are some anarchic themes in vegan philosophy. Only when we see the vegan reform as a doctrine not of restriction, as those who oppose it mistakenly believe, but of freedom, do we fully comprehend it. Mm-hmm. So it's a big picture idea. There's a couple of interesting things in this quote. First one, the vegan reform. In our day and age, we tend to think of the word reform as a bit weak and wishy-washy. But in those days, it was quite a powerful thing because they associate it with a cause. So they're talking about cultural reform, which meant cultural transformation. So it wasn't such a weak word in those days. And then this bit about those who oppose it mistakenly believe, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the people who oppose veganism often say that it's restricted, and that normally they're talking about the diet at this point. Whereas what vegans will say is that they've never eaten better and they've never eaten more varied when they went onto a plant-based diet. So even if we're just talking about the dietary aspects of veganism, the view of those who oppose us is wrong. It's not restriction. It's actually quite liberating to suddenly have a plate full of beautiful vegetables, you know, and lots of them. It's not exactly meat and 2 veg. You know, that's a restricted diet. That's the restricted diet, which is really kind of interesting. Now, Surge of Freedom is a really important essay. And it's interesting because the quote here is the first line from the essay. And basically said that he's going to try and lay out what veganism is, because they're at the end of the process now. And so vegan philosophy is kind of being set now, in a sense. And the interesting part of the first sentence for me is the fact that the first thing they do is focus on what the benefits to humanity would be. Right. Now, we've got to understand this, I think, is the fact that they weren't writing for Twitter in those days. They weren't writing sound bites. So you kind of have to read the entirety of their essays to really fully get it. But they weren't frightened to say, okay, veganism is a lot about us. And they said that first. But of course, then they started talking about other animals as well. So this is where you get the full story. And in a sense, they developed this idea, which I call focus and scope, which we're going to move on to. At the same time, you know, they were quite happy to talk about the scope first, you know, which is very important. Now, this is an interesting idea because Watson and Cross thought that veganism was going to do a lot of work. It's going to kind of do a lot of things for both humans and other animals. Mm-hmm. And this is a quote from Cross. Veganism owes its birth to the fact that at the deepest point within us, we believe impregnably in freedom. So freedom becomes another word that becomes very important within the early years. Exploitation also. And then this is where they start to develop the idea that veganism is a really big idea. Veganism should not be regarded as a mere side shoot in human evolution, so evolution comes back into it, but as a central extending growth of considerable significance. So they're starting to understand that veganism is actually a big radical idea, and that veganism is going to be a real kind of benefit to the world in general, if you like. And as always, they say by liberating ourselves, we liberate others, and by liberating others, we liberate ourselves. Watson had already talked, so this is back in 1945, about the greatest cause on earth, and they started to think in big terms. What Cross said was that veganism extended justice over the species barrier. So again, that's a very big kind of idea. He said that other movements stopped there. The real significance of veganism is its devastating illogical demonstration that by denying to non-human animals the right to be free, we keep locked against ourselves the gateway to our own pursuit of happiness. Again, we're getting this, this theme being rehearsed. Mm-hmm. And now they bring in the idea of rights. Until the advent of veganism, comparatively few humans regarded the animals as being either worthy of or entitled to the right to be free. So again, freedom is the key thing. And probably fewer still realize the impressive effect which the granting of such a right would have on the freedom of humanity. So yet again, we see this entangled idea that if we grant rights to other animals, we are liberating ourselves as well. It's interesting, this one, because this was written quite a long time before the Case for Animal Rights, which came out in the early 80s. And it kind of gets the idea of animal rights a little bit wrong, but it's interesting that they were talking in these terms back in those days. And again, you've got that idea that by liberating others, we liberate ourselves. So we're coming near to the end now. So I say that when you look at Leslie Cross's work, you're looking at what he calls the focus and the scope. He talks about two broad aims of veganism. The first is the obvious focus part, that veganism is about not exploiting other animals. That's the first thing. And they even then started to define what exploitation meant, because this shows that veganism is not a diet, because it says that we want to end all use of other animals. So obviously for food, but also we don't see them as commodities. We don't make them work. We wouldn't hunt them. We wouldn't test on them. All the uses of other animals would end through vivisection, through veganism. I keep saying vivisection, don't I? Okay. By the adoption of this rule, the society has clearly come out on the side of the liberators. So again, this idea that we're looking for freedom for all, in a sense, and that they're again restating that they're abolitionists. And this is where we get the idea that a vegan world would be a different world, and we would essentially be different types of human beings. We would not be violent anymore. And he said, no longer warmongering. And again, we've got to realize that we are talking about a movement that saw its birth during a world war. They declared peace in a world war. It would mean an immense change of heart and mind for humans. And they believed that the vegan world would be able to do that.
Yeah.
And then right at the end now, some of the ideas are obvious, the changes, and some are not so obvious. So the obvious ones are the ones that we've kind of almost like seen already. Obviously, in the vegan world, there'd be no butcher's shops. There would be vegan milk, as they were developing at the time. This one is an interesting one. This sounds very modern, this claim. The countryside will not be heavy with the anguish of cows crying for their calves. Now, we say this, don't we, in the 21st century, and yet they were talking about this in the 1950s as well. Of course, there would be no slaughterhouses in a vegan world. There would be no vivisection laboratories, and no one would go hunting.
Yeah.
And then, yet again, we get the caveat, because some of the changes of bringing about a vegan world are not so obvious, and those are the ones that affect us. And he says that human health, both physical and mental, will be vastly improved. What they meant by this is that we would release ourselves from the burden of being exploiters.
Yeah.
We would no longer be exploiters. And that in itself would be a wonderful thing.
Well, I know for a fact that the people that work in those slaughterhouses are severely mentally disturbed by what they have to go through, and they're often exploited themselves. I mean, the culture created in those animal exploitation industries is terrible, and I'm sure that mental illness spreads like the plague, if you will. Like, I can't imagine that the weight lifted off people's shoulders to not have to be constantly torturing these animals.
Yes, absolutely, and also not having to consume them.
Yeah.
Because, metabolizing violence 3 times a day can't be good for us. Really.
You're eating those energies.
Yeah. I mean, we're eating violence,
Mm-hmm.
Taking that inside us. And just on that level, it can't be a very good idea, really, This is the final thing now. And it said that man, obviously they wrote in those terms in those days, man would have to radically change. But they were kind of saying, but don't be scared of the change. Embrace it. Because the change is going to be glorious. They really did have a kind of, some people might dismiss it as utopian, but they had a grand vision of a vegan future where humanity would be much less violent, much more peaceful. And, we wouldn't be reaching for the gun in order to resolve our problems. Mm-hmm. We would find a different way. And in terms of the modern day articulation of these ideas, this book here, David Nybert, Animal Rights, Human Rights, and the subtitle here is very important, Entanglements of Oppression and Liberation. So our oppression and our liberation are entangled with other ideas. That comes from David Nybert, or Nibert, some people say. And then this other one in the small box is a kind of slogan that came to being in the 70s and the 80s, human freedom, animal rights, one struggle, one fight. These are kind of continuations of the ideas that the people who started our movement developed. Mm-hmm. And they really did think that if we liberate other animals, we were liberating ourselves. And that was the kind of glorious part of veganism, if you like. Right. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in.
Oh, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's fascinating that that they define veganism as a revolution, because it really does validate the extent of how much it really can do. And I think we're starting to see that with, the UN reports, and finally getting people to see, about carbon footprints. Like, the environmental side is really validating it, but it's fascinating that they were able to do this so early on. That people were talking about this.
Yeah, I agree very strongly with that. Because, it does show really that what we now call vegan philosophy is kind of central to everything that's good and opposes everything that's bad. So if we care about the planet, then we obviously say, well, veganism is a big part of that. Even if we care individually about our health, then veganism is part of that. But in terms of the real focus of veganism, then if we care about the exploitation and the oppression of other animals, then obviously veganism is the central core idea that will get us out of that. Vegetarian doesn't kind of make it, No. Flexitarian doesn't quite do it, reducetarian. None of those ideas, they might be seen, if you like, as building blocks towards, but none of them really fulfill what we're looking for, which is the abolition of the exploitation, which is what they talked about all the time.
And why do you think humans are so focused on isolating ourselves from other species? I mean, we are so obsessed with the idea of humans being the best animals out there. Like, why do you think that is?
Well, you're bringing out the sociologist in me now, because you know, human beings tend to like to create boundaries and barriers, and we will pick on little differences. And of course, you know, whether it's gender based or racially based or obviously species, if we see a difference, we use that, and we normally then start to use that to kind of talk about differences in status. So it's a kind of status thing. And we've got this idea that we're the top of the food chain. You know, we're above them and they are lower creatures. And we used to call them things like the lower animals and beasts, you know, those kind of things. Even in some of the writing of the pioneers, they kind of get sucked into using that kind of pejorative language, you know, creatures and, you know, the lower beings, that kind of stuff. And so there's this idea of hierarchy, you know, and, you know, human beings love hierarchies. And so, you know, we can kind of set ourselves above lots and lots of other beings. And we've created this massive barrier called the species barrier. Yeah. You know, which is incredibly useful. In fact, it's useful is if you want to oppress other humans, all you need to do is throw them conceptually over the species barrier, and you can then see them as lesser than. You know, they're on the wrong side of the species barrier suddenly.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I guess we are obsessed with categorizing things.
Yeah, we do it all the time. Yeah, that's right.
And
we do it all the time.
Yeah, and our ideas of veganism have progressed a lot over the decades. How has, I mean, you've been involved in the animal rights movement for a long time. It's really commendable. How has the general population's idea of animal rights and animal liberation changed since you first got started?
Well, on the one hand, there's more acceptance of it because, I mean, even Peter Singer started the book Animal Liberation from 1975 with almost like an apology, saying, well, you know, this might seem as some kind of a parody for women's liberation or human liberation, but it's not, type of thing. So people don't react in that way anymore. So the idea of animal liberation and animal rights, it doesn't cause people to fall off their chairs laughing, if you like. At the same time, there's still a little bit of confusion within the movement about the difference between, say, animal welfare and animal rights. So we've never really developed a very strong animal rights movement, which is based on, say, the work of Tom Reagan, because animal welfare, in a way, gets in the way of that. And so there is a kind of development. There's more acceptance of the idea, I think, but there's still a way to go in terms of the clarity of what we want to say and the basis upon which we want to say it. I'm myself a rights-based person, so I tend to use phrases like rights-based animal rights, which is a clumsy phrase, but it's kind of necessary because most animal rights is not rights-based, which is a bit odd, you know. But so there's still a few things to be sorted out philosophically in the movement, really. Yeah.
And especially in a country like Morocco, tying it in because this is Vegfest Morocco. I think the general Moroccan population, they're beginning to like animals more and like to spend time with them more. I think the amount of pets that people have, or the amount of households that have pets, has gone up in recent years. But there's still that disconnect. What conversations do you suggest that people have with people to kind of help people stop seeing animals as objects?
Well, I would say, first of all, in terms of pet owning and stuff like that, is we've tended to evolve our ideas. We went from pets to companion animals and now to animal companions. But also, really, one thing that would be a progress would be for people to realize that loving other animals is not as important as respecting them.
Yeah.
And we need to respect them as fellow rights bearers. And so rights will clash. And sometimes the interests of some rights bearers will get in the way of other rights bearers. But the point is, if we approach that problem with the understanding that we're all talking about fellow rights bearers, then that in itself is a progress. So animal rights is not based on loving them or having mercy for other animals. It's about respecting them for who they are, you know, and so that in itself would be a major advance if we we're able to expand the idea that we should respect other animals for who they are, rather than because we love them or that we've got them as companions and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Almost like seeing them as their own individuals, but at the same time, not trying to humanize them, because they don't necessarily need to be humanized. Like to be respected. That's
right. Yeah. Tom Reagan always said that other animals are in the world. They're aware of the world. They're aware of what happens to them, and what happens to them matters to them. Mm-hmm. And if we understand that, you know, they are beings with their own interests, and whether it's that their interests are useful to us or not, you know, some people say things like, well, if we don't eat cows, what will we use them for? Well, you know, we're looking at that idea the wrong way. It's not about our functional kind of use of them. It's kind of they have a right because they're there, because of who they are, not because they fulfill some function. You know, the utility of other animals is not the key to it. It's the fact that we see them as rights bearers, and that when we exploit them, that's a rights violation. That's the fundamental of animal rights.
They're not here for our use, and we've completely forgotten that.
Yeah, well, this is where the idea that we need to be animal lovers kind of clouds the issue a little bit, or that we need to have mercy, and that, because that's a very kind of status-driven type thing, you know, oh, have mercy. Even the language of cruelty can be a problem, kind of, you know, don't be cruel, because animal rights is demand, you know, do not violate their rights. Is much better than, oh, don't be cruel or have mercy. So animal rights is like veganism, a radical idea, but it's got a demand in it. It's not kind of begging for mercy, and it's not begging for people not to be cruel. It's saying, look, these are beings in their own rights, and we need to respect their rights. It's a stronger claim.
Yeah, that's, I mean, you got it. That's a fantastic point. And getting a little bit more personal, you've been passionate about animal rights for several decades, but only recently have you kind of gone down the academic route. Is that correct? In the past, since like I think 2005?
Yeah, well, I was kind of forced into it in a sense, because I had some time off, you might say, from animal rights. But I decided that, you know, if I'm going to be kind of excluded from society for a while, I would put my time to good use. And so that's why I went into that. And also, I came to realize that if we understood the world from an academic point of view, we could understand the issues of animal rights better. And so sociology is really good for understanding the world. It understands kind of power structures and that kind of stuff, and power relations. Psychology is also useful. Social psychology is useful. So the academic world can teach a social movement a lot of things, and the social movement can inform the academic world as well, which is what's going on now with, say, vegan sociology. There's a big move with people like Dr. Corey Wren doing vegan sociology, and there's lots of books and conferences and that being done. And it's a kind of two-way street, that academia learns about other animals and the social movement, and academia can also feed some really good ideas into a social movement. So I see that as very positive. It's one of the most positive things that's going on right now, I think.
That's fantastic. Do you help you legitimize your argument?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, a little. Well, yes and no, because people tend to, well, you know, I don't make a big thing about Dr. Roger Yates, and also people who hear that don't take much notice of it anyway. So it doesn't necessarily do me any favors in that sense. I kind of probably thought it would give you a bit of kind of gravitas, if you like, but it doesn't really. But it is good to have some foundation to your arguments. You're not just making it up on the hoof, as it were.
Yeah.
Are we allowed to say that on the hoof? I don't know.
I'm sure it's fine. Well, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for talking to us.
You're very welcome.
Do you have something you'd like to say to Vegfest Morocco or the African activists working towards animal rights?
Yes, I want to say that, you know, you're part of a big idea, a global idea, and it would be good for the African activists to kind of forge their own kind of identity and to become a stronger, more prominent voice. The movement is too white, for one thing. The movement is too male-dominated, for another. If Morocco can play some role in correcting those problems, that will be a grand thing for the future. So in terms of Vegfest, I hope it goes on from strength to strength. And, you know, you've made a brilliant start, let's face it. And so hopefully in the future, it will get better and better.
Inshallah, as we say. Basically means like hopefully.
Yes.
God willing.
Yeah. Well, I'm quite, you know, it's the same with all activists, isn't it? You know, you try to be optimistic, and every now and again you hear something new and you think, oh dear, you know, but you try to be optimistic. We have to be, really.
Well, I really, really appreciate you taking the time out of your Sunday morning to talk to us, or Sunday afternoon. I feel like we've learned a lot, and you've been clear and concise, and you've got some amazing ideas. Thank you so much.